Hi, this is Isabel Plant, and I'm going to be discussing Noteflight, the music notation web app. So the description online of Noteflight is an online in-browser music notation software that allows users to create, view, print, and hear professional quality music notation. How I introduce Noteflight to my students. The first thing we do, I do this with my grade 9 students, is that we start by composing on paper, and I ask them to do a few little exercises. And then I use Noteflight to actually make an exercise for them to compose on. Small little detail is that a frustration is that I had to white out, the whole rest before I photocopied it. And just get them composing and writing by hand and getting used to the idea of composing. And they have their instruments in their own hands, and they can sort of noodle around on their instruments to sort of make sense of what they're writing. Once they get a little bit more experienced with the idea of composing, then I start demoing Noteflight on the smartboard, and I just show them how to write a short little 2-bar melody, and I show them how to use accidentals and change the rhythms. So let's go look at that right now. So I'm in Noteflight, and I'm going to create a new score. And I don't use the piano functionality, so I'm going to turn it off. And I'm going to write something for flute. So I'm going to click on the guitar where it says parts. And I'm going to add woodwind, flute, and say okay. And then I'm going to get rid of this piano because I don't need the piano. Then I teach them how to add a title, my song, add their name, and here where it says lyricist, I encourage them to write what instrument they're composing for, because there are many transposing instruments. Then the next thing I teach them is to look at their palette and just see if they have everything they need here, and if they don't, to turn it on. Generally, they just need score, edit, duration. They definitely get confused between duration and rhythm. You don't need rhythm. Pitch is useful, and having measures is also useful. And then I teach them to just sort of click around the first measure, and when it turns orange, they're ready to go. And then with their mouse, they can start on a note. And I say, don't worry about what note it is. Like, just click while it's orange still, even if the cursor is on the next beat. If you use the arrows on the keyboard, you can right away, change the note and not worry about hitting the exact right line or space. So I'm on flute. We generally start it on a B flat, especially because we're beginner instruments. And sometimes right away I'll just show them that's a B natural. We need a B flat. And so while it's still orange, let's go change the pitch from a B natural to a B flat. Now we're ready to go on to the next next note, and let's say we wanted to change the rhythm. We could potentially, the cursor's blinking here, but if we change anything like the rhythm, then the note changes. Not what we want. So I teach them to sometimes, again, use the arrow keys. Now it's orange, and now they can add the next note. And while it's orange, then they can still change the rhythm. And then again, you can either just move the mouse over to the next beat, or I encourage them to use, again, the arrows. I find it really useful to use arrows. And then let's go to the next note. And but let's maybe make that a flat. And I just maybe write 2 measures. Let's say I didn't need these 3 measures. I highlight it. And if you press Shift and then use the arrows, you can actually then select all 3 measures. And there's a plus and minus sign. You can get rid of all of those. And so there's my 1 measure composition. And then I show them how they can go ahead and listen to it. Yeah, and then if they wanted to continue editing, you press Edit and all that. And when they're done their composition, or let's say the class is over, I have to remind them to press the Save button, because Noteflight doesn't auto-save. We'll talk about that now in a moment. So that's kind of how I demonstrate on the smartboard. I don't go too much into it, just sort of the basics. Because the next exercise I do is I've written out an 8-bar melody I'll do it for the flute, and I'll also do it, I'll do it in the flutes. It doesn't really matter what instrument I choose for my band. And I also do it for the guitar students in tab, and I also do it in regular notation. And I give them a copy of this paper exercise, and I ask them to use Noteflight and recopy what I've composed. And I make sure that there's all kinds of incidentals and rhythms, and then so they really learn to navigate this website. And they work, and then they can either ask their neighbors for help and teach each other, or they can flag me down and ask me specific questions. And I would say within like 20-30 minutes, the students can navigate Noteflight pretty well. So some of the pitfalls and workarounds. The first pitfall I was not expecting is when we were registering for Noteflight, we use Microsoft Outlook as our school emails, and our email verification was not going through. It was being blocked by the school board, so none of my students were able to sign up for Outlook. It was very frustrating. And I had students who had learned Noteflight in grade 6. That was one reason I chose to use Noteflight. And they couldn't remember their passwords either, and so it was a big frustration. So our workaround was to use a personal email, like their Gmail or Hotmail, and then use that email verification to then open your account. But the other pitfall is that our school does not allow for cell phones in class. So if you used your, let's say, your Gmail account and you had two-step authentication, you couldn't go and deal with that two-step authentication process. So then when we hit that pitfall, I just suggested to those students to start using flat.io and give that a go, because there was no issues with registering that with our school Outlook. So I had, students doing both, and we called it like the orange one and the blue one, and we all worked around it, and they're close enough. I've experienced in both, so we just went with the flow. The second issue was really this: when you open your new score, it's always defaulted into piano staff. And when my students would choose their instrumentation and replace piano with flutes, they would hear the sound of the flute, but you would always see the piano staff with the bass clef, and that really confused my students. So I had to work around what I did, like in my example, you leave the piano, you add a second instrument, and then you delete the piano. And that was the workaround. The third pitfall was really that palette. If kids selected everything, they got so confused. There's just too much visually on the page. And that's why I really had to just say, look, you don't need that many things laid out there. Just really duration, pitch, measure, score, and edit, and you're good to go. The fourth pitfall was really for the guitar students. It was actually a lot easier to work with flat.io when it came to guitar tabs and notation, because if you selected guitar as your instrument, it defaulted to selecting both. And so if you were working with regular notes, the tab would appear, or if you're working with the tabs, the notes would appear. And the other thing is, if you had if you wanted the actual guitar fretboard to be there, you could actually also use that to compose with. Whereas when you're working in Noteflight, you had to pick one, either notation or tab. You couldn't have both easily. And if you wanted to compose with the guitar frets and all that, it was a default piano keyboard, which was frustrating because we don't teach piano. And I also found it a little difficult because there's like these imaginary little boxes when you're working with the rhythms, which were hard to sort of navigate and gauge. But the students did get the hang of it, but it was a little frustrating. It was actually easier to compose on paper for my guitar students or with flat.io. And the fifth pitfall was really the no auto saving to the cloud and having to remember to press, save with the cloud and the up arrow. Whereas, flat.io has automatic saving. But at least, this message, unsaved changes, would appear, and you could then save your changes, but sometimes it couldn't, and so you would still lose your material. And there is the version control button, which I do teach students how to use, even with like Google Documents and all that. I love using version control. So I do teach my students that, this also has it, and sometimes that can save us from losing our content. In final remarks, I would like to just say it was really quite easy for my students to jump into using notation software. And I really like Flat.io, but I like Noteflight also. And really, I jumped into Noteflight a lot because, like I said, some of my grade 6 feeders used it. And so I figured, you know what, let's build on what they already know. And so it's going really well so far, and I look forward to seeing my students' compositions.